Hey buddy, watch this.
Hello, Regis Kilbin is the name and Hearthstone is the game, and I want to talk about the best and worst of the leaked Slush cards. Now, you might be asking, what on earth is a Slush card? Why didn't I hear about this? What leak are you talking about? Well, let me walk you through it really quickly. Slush cards are essentially cards that Blizzard designed and tested and they were playing around with, potentially to include in past or future Hearthstone expansions, but for one reason or another they didn't quite make the cut, or they didn't thematically fit, or they were going to be too overpowered in that particular standard format rotation. So they essentially put all of these sort of extra cards into a slush pool. And Blizzard has referenced this in the past in articles like, oh, we tried out some of these things and they didn't work, so on and so forth. But we've never really seen what this slush pool was until recently in a patch that introduced the Monster Hunt, I believe, with Witchwood. They accidentally included a bunch of data on these slush cards. So basically we got this like super cool look into how Blizzard thinks about design and some of the cards they might have thought were too powerful or didn't quite fit, and that's awesome. That's so cool because it gives us insights, of course, into what they're thinking and what might come along down the road, and maybe things that seem too overpowered. Now, I'm not going to talk about all of these slush cards in this video. I picked out 5 of my favorites and 5 of my least favorites. I'm going to cover those. If you do want to see the rest of the slush cards that were in the data dump from this latest patch, you can see that in a link below in the description from Hearthstone Top Decks. But I went through this list of all these different slush cards and picked out the 5 that I thought had some of the best designs and 5 that had essentially the worst designs, maybe the most overpowered or dangerous designs. And that's what we're going to talk about here in this video. So that said, up first, I want to talk about the cards I liked the most. So let's go ahead and jump into the 5 best slush cards. So up first here I have the Gnome Napper, and this slush card might look a little bit familiar to you if you're someone who watches a lot of Hearthstone videos, because this was actually teased in a previous video, official Hearthstone video near the announcement of the Witchwood, referencing some of the tested card ideas they had played around with. So I picked this card essentially because it serves 2 purposes. One, it kind of confirms this theory of the slush card set and that these are actually coming from reality, but also just because I think this is a super cool mechanic that Hearthstone would be very lucky to have. Because essentially with the way Gnome Napper works here, you're creating this really nifty and fun strategic back and forth between your opponents. You get to discover a minion. It's from all of the available minions with a slight bias towards class cards, as discover effects always work. So for instance, you could be a paladin and you could see a Tyrion and a Stonehill Defender and a Leper Gnome. And you say, okay, man, I really want that Tyrion, but if I pick Tyrion, my opponent's probably going to assume I take a Tyrion, because they know I am going to take a good card, and Tyrion is outright the best card, and maybe I can play it next turn. So maybe I should take the Stonehill Defender instead, because I could still create a Tyrion, and that might throw my opponent off the scent a little bit. But then what if they expect me to do that? What if they know I'm going to take the Stonehill Defender to trick them? Then I should really take the Tyrion. And it goes back to your opponent when they get to make the choice at the start of the next turn, and it's like, man, did they take the Stonehill Defender to trick me, or did they take the Tyrion? Maybe they threw the Leper Gnome out there just to be completely safe, and they're looking for a couple extra damage. And there are these just super mind games going back and forth between each opponent. And I love the idea of that, because it's kind of luck-based, but it's also really strategy-based, and it tests your understanding of your opponent and what they need and where the matchup is. And that back and forth is so cool. So I would love a card like Gnome Napper. Now, there were a few different versions in the Slush set of all the 300 some odd cards, I think, that were leaked in total. And any of them could have been chosen here, but I took Gnome Napper because it was the most convenient and recognizable. As a 5-mana 5/5, I'm not sure this is the most compelling version or the most playable version of all of those different options, but nonetheless, I still like what it represents as a mechanic. And by the way, I think Blizzard called the mechanic like the Mysteries mechanic, so sure, we can call it that if you want. But I would love to see that introduced. If not in the Witchwood, obviously it didn't make the cut, but in the future, if this came back to life and showed up in Hearthstone, I would be a very happy Hearthstone player. So moving on to the next card here, you can see where Sonya Shadowdancer got her name, and again, these are thrown away cards. So if this card were to come back in the future, it probably wouldn't be called Sonya Shadowdancer since we already have that card, but this was an idea for a rogue legendary that Blizzard obviously had in the past. It's a 2-mana 3/2 with stealth, and it reads, your hero looks like a different class's hero until your first turn. That is absolutely awesome. I love the idea of Rogue being this sort of master of disguise, right? We don't get the sneakiness of Rogue all that often. We get the stealing aspect of Rogue, where they steal stuff from their opponent's class, but the sneakiness, the stealth side of things, is just not that well conveyed in Hearthstone today, and this card would convey that perfectly. And it would be really, really good too, I think, because essentially this denies your opponent the ability to make a sound mulligan decision. Because if they think you're a warlock, it's like, oh my god, I'm playing Q-Block. I've got to go for late game control. I got to find silences. I need to make sure I have value pieces. They mulligan for that. They get into the game. Remember, this is actually until your first turn. So if they go first, like if you're on the coin playing Sonya Shadowdancer here and your opponent goes first, they don't even know you're not a warlock until they pass it back to you. So theoretically, they could even make a first turn decision based on the wrong class being across from them. And essentially, if you're building this in, say, an aggro deck and they think you're a control deck, they've essentially made all of their early game mulligan decisions, perhaps even their turn 1 decision, based on the completely wrong class. And that's going to give you a huge advantage. And frankly, Sonya Shadowdancer herself, a solid minion. A 2-mana 3/2 with stealth is ultimately not that bad. That's a normal stat line for a 2-drop, and the stealth gives it some upside. So if you built this into an aggro deck and you were looking to apply some early game pressure via dangerous minions, Sonya Shadowdancer would fit perfectly anyway. So all in all, a strong card that would have a really cool and fun effect that would make Rogue do something different and unique that we haven't seen in the past, and would really live up to the fantasy of Rogue as far as I'm concerned. So now moving on to the next card here, we have Hunter's Alec the Boy Scout, a 5-mana 4/5 that reads, pick 3 extra cards when you build your deck, and then battle cry, discover one of them. So Alec the Boy Scout here is essentially what you'd call a sideboard in other card games, and this means that you could do things like add 3 different tech cards into your deck. So you could add like a Spellbreaker for silence, and you could add a Chief Inspector for secret removal, and you could add just, I don't know, an Acidic Swamp Ooze for weapon removal. And therefore you have 3 new tech cards available to you that you don't actually have to run in your normal deck. So they don't take up a card slot, they don't sacrifice the integrity of your deck. Instead, you would run Alec the Boy Scout as your sort of single-use tech card that only takes up 1 spot instead of 3, but it would still allow you to draw into or find that specific tech card that you needed for any given matchup. And essentially that makes your ladder experience a much better and smoother one, because instead of trying to tech for 3 or 4 different decks that are really prominent in the meta, you can build your deck like you want, include 1 tech card that gives you answers to various things. And I don't know that this is necessarily something that would be good in only a single class. That might give, for instance, Hunter a really big advantage. I almost wish this is something that was available to everybody. That said, if it was available to everybody as a neutral card, it would probably be run in every single deck in Hearthstone, and that wouldn't be very good for the game. So really the fix might be just adding a sideboard to Hearthstone of some sort. But this would be an elegant way to do that, I suppose, and keeping it restricted to 1 class does keep it a little bit unique and make sure that it's not like the most played card in the entire game, which it might very well be if it were a neutral card. But as far as stats are considered here, you are paying a little bit of a penalty, of course. A 4/5 for 5, not very exciting. It does generate you a card, which is nice, but again, you will have to pay the money, or there's money in the background here, guys. The mana, excuse me, you will have to pay the mana, pay to win, to get this tech card into play. So it's not like you could play your Alec the Boy Scout and immediately employ that silence or that weapon removal. You might have to wait for a future turn or something down the road. So it still has some limitations, still has some restrictions, but gives you that extra flexibility and power, which I think is cool. So is this a perfect execution of that sideboard idea? Not necessarily, but I like that Blizzard has that sort of thing in mind. They're considering options there, and they might move forward in some way to give us a better flexibility option as far as tech cards are concerned. So up next here is a Priest Slush card, the Warped Cultist, a 3-mana 3/4 that I have a feeling probably just turned into Cabal Talon Priest at some point, because this battlecry says give your hero +3 health as opposed to giving a minion +3 health, but everything else is exactly the same. So that said, I think this is a much, much cooler version. Cabal Talon Priest was a great card, strong card, maybe a little bit too strong sometimes just because it could provide a lot of onboard power. But Warped Cultist does something that I think is really important for Priest that Priest has never had access to, or at least has had access to, but can be pretty challenging, which is getting your health total above 30. Something that Warrior can do very successfully with their hero power. But Priest essentially runs into a lot of opportunity, a lot of points in various game states where their hero power just becomes completely dead because there's no way for them to heal themselves anymore. But a card like Warped Cultist allows you to play a reasonably statted minion onto the board in the early and mid game that offers you some long-term benefit via adding health. Not only is that like more leeway to work with in a slower deck where you're trying to stay alive, like that is just bonus health, but also if your opponent chips you for 2 or 3 or 4, you know, in the past you'd cast like Greater Healing Potion when you had like 22 health and you'd be like, ugh, I wasted a few points on my Greater Healing Potion, but I need to squeeze in this mana, I need this heal. Cards like Warped Cultist could essentially help prevent that from being as big of an issue. You've just got more room to work with when it comes to healing. So I like the idea of this. Is this the exact right way to do it? Probably not. It's not perfect. I honestly think it could be like +5 health or something like that to make it even better. But maybe at different mana cost, maybe at different stats. Blizzard could obviously figure that out. But the idea of giving Priest a way to empower their hero power a little more, particularly with things like Baku hanging around now where your hero power becomes even better at filling in all those health gaps, a card like this would work really, really well in that environment. And then finally here I have a Warlock Slush card, the Library Rummager. And I'm pretty sure this one's going to show up in our Netherstorm expansion that'll be hitting this summer. You heard it here first. This is a 5-mana 4/4 with a battlecry that reads, discard your hand and draw that many cards. And this is exactly what everyone has always been asking for when it comes to discard Warlock. We've always wanted a way to get rid of all those cards but instantly refill. So there's still a bit of a penalty, right? Because you're losing cards in hand, you're losing the flexibility and decision-making options that those cards provided. There's a price to pay with Library Rummager. Of course, you're losing a lot of cards at the bottom of your deck. Essentially, if the game goes long, you have less resources to work with. But ultimately, you can discard without quite as much penalty as normal, where you just lose those cards outright and you don't gain anything in their stead. But with Library Rummager, you could activate the Warlock quest so quickly. Lucari Sacrifice is done and you get your portal. Boom, boom, boom. Discard Warlock works instantly with this sort of card. Now, there are, of course, some scary discard rewards with something like Library Rummager. That's an issue to consider. Maybe that's why Blizzard didn't want to print this at the same time as Silverware Golem, because it might be just way too consistent. But despite that, this does come down at 5 mana. It doesn't have the greatest stats in itself, so I'm not even sure if it summoned a couple Silverware Golems, if it would be all that oppressive compared to some of the stuff that happens in Hearthstone these days. So even then, I think it would have been fine. But my guess is this is still going to show up, and they're going to give us one last final push to make discard Warlock work, I actually believe. And this card might be exactly what we've needed, and I've wanted that to work for a really, really long time. Discard is just such a core mechanic to the classic set for Warlock with things like Doomguard, and they tried to prop it up with the Warlock quest. It never took, and I thought that was a real shame. So I would like to see something like Library Rummager in action. It might just be the perfect discard Warlock card. So now that we've talked about the cards I like from a design standpoint the most, I'd like to move on to some of the cards that I think could be problematic. Some of these Slush cards look like they might just be too overpowered, or I don't like the design emphasis, or they could build towards some dangerous trends in Hearthstone. So let's go ahead and look at the 5 worst Slush cards. Up first here is Nestam, King of the Kobolds. Obviously this one was going to be meant for Kobolds and Catacombs. It's a 1-mana 1/3 with a battlecry that reads, order your deck by cost with the cheapest stuff on top. And that to me is just way too powerful, because this essentially becomes one of those cards like Prince Keleseth, where if you drew it in your mulligan and you knew you could get this thing out on turn 1, it's going to give you such a perfect opportunity to just steamroll your opponents that I think it would be way too good and way too frustrating to play against, because it's such a high roll opportunity. Now, it would take a lot of work and experimenting and science, I think, to figure out an optimized deck list to make this work, because essentially you wouldn't want like too many 2-drops or too many 3-drops, because then you draw too many 2-drops in a row. You wouldn't want to draw like 5 straight 2-drops. That might be too slow. You might want to curve out a little better than that. But essentially with something like this, you could play Nestam on 1, and then Keleseth would come automatically on turn 2, essentially, and then you could maybe have a really crazy powerful turn 3 guarantee, and it would just snowball onto this ridiculous chain of events that you could build in such oppressive ways, I'm sure. The possibility for this to become too good and too scary seems far too high for me. It wouldn't work in every deck. Of course, you wouldn't always draw it, so there'd be some downsides, but we've seen in the past deck building restraints don't seem all that bad anymore compared to what we used to believe. If you can make it work, if you can create those high roll opportunities, those sorts of decks and these sorts of cards can empower some really ridiculous stuff. So Nestam essentially just scares me a ton because of the amount of influence and control it gives you over your draw, removing a lot of randomness, giving you some very scary power bands in the early to mid game. This card looks horrifyingly, frighteningly good as far as I'm concerned. So up next here we have Mrs. Magical Leopleuradon. This would have been a 7-mana 5/5 beast, and its battle cry is just way too chaotic, way too RNG focused for me to ever get behind a card like this. It reads battle cry, replace your hero power with cast a random spell. That is just absurd. First off, incredibly dangerous, because some classes have really good random spell pools, stuff that's just like universal removal, or like mage with secrets, for instance, could be really good. And yes, all of that could backfire, but some classes would benefit from it way more than others, and I think this would be an incredibly strong card in a class like Mage, for instance, where there's just a lot of good default stuff. Hunter would also be great with things like Animal Companion and all the secrets and removal that works only against enemies like Deadly Shot and Multi-Shot, those sorts of things. So essentially, this thing could be ridiculously good, but also the game just doesn't need so much more randomness. I hope Blizzard never prints a card like this. It'd be so frustrating to play against. The high rolls could be ridiculous. There's very little you can do to actually influence this or prevent this or stop this from just winning games in absurd ways. So to me, Mrs. Magical Leopleuradon has no place in Hearthstone. So moving on to the third card here, I think is one of the worst. This is the Naga Myrmidon. It's a 4-mana 4/4 that reads, when you draw this, summon a 1/1 Murloc. And once again, I think this card just adds a little bit too much RNG into the game. Now, I'll be honest, I don't think this specific design of the card is too crazy dangerous. Summoning a 1/1 Murloc isn't like a game-ending, game-swinging sort of play necessarily, particularly because the Naga itself is fairly understated for its cost. A 4-mana 4/4 just isn't that exciting. But I think this one creates a really dangerous trend, which is adding more random elements that are tied and attached to card draw, which is already a random element. So basically you're doubling down on the randomness, where any given card draw has even more potential to sort of mysteriously and unreasonably impact a game. And we've seen in the past, even just summoning a 1/1 with patches for free can be very powerful. Now, this Murloc would not have charged. They actually did show it. It's just a totally blank 1/1 Murloc. So it wouldn't ever be totally unbelievably amazing, but imagine, for instance, your opponent drew 2 straight Naga Myrmidons, and they had 2 1/1 Murlocs for free, and they already had some Murlocs on board, or they had a War Leader in hand. Suddenly, that's a lot of upside that you as an opponent had no way to influence. You couldn't control it, you couldn't stop it, and it was all just connected to whether or not they got lucky and drew the right card at the right time. And that's something we already have in Hearthstone, but this would essentially make it worse. So to me, maybe this card itself wouldn't be all that bad. We could probably survive. We could get by. I don't think this would be too strong or too impactful. But this idea, this trend, this mechanic is not something that I want to see in Hearthstone. So even though this isn't the greatest offender itself, Blizzard needs to be really careful exploring this design space because it is something that could get out of hand way too quickly. Talking about things that could get out of hand too quickly, this is Blackhand the Destroyer. This would have been a 4-mana 3/5, and it reads, whenever you gain armor, gain twice as much. Now, I'm going to be honest, the greedy, super control, incredibly high armor total version of me that is pretty prominently centered in my heart of hearts would absolutely adore this card. Like, I love the idea of getting like 1,000 armor, right? I just want to have all of the healths. Give me as much health, as much armor as possible. I love that Justicar True Heart style of play back in the day where you get 60, 70, 80 armor. And Blackhand the Destroyer would play right into that. You could do some absolutely absurd stuff with Blackhand the Destroyer. Particularly, just think about the card Bring It On, for instance. That gives you 10 armor, right? It has a downside, but it gives you 10 armor. A card that has been played in constructed format already. Suddenly, with Blackhand the Destroyer and 2 Bring It Ons, you're talking about a 40 armor gain turn for only 8 mana. Yes, there's a downside, but Warrior has already navigated that downside successfully, so you can't weigh that downside too strongly against it. If you toss in another Baku hero power, that's a 48 armor, 10 mana board state, essentially, or swing in a single turn. And that is just bonkers. Absolutely ridiculous. You add in a Dead Man's Hand, guess what? You can do that every time you draw all of those cards. So you basically could just snowball it absolutely absurdly. Even with things like Armor Smith, this card might get too oppressive too quickly. There are so many ways for Warrior to like create copies of minions. For instance, with like Blackhand the Destroyer, if you got 2 or 3 of these out, if it's stacked, that might be absurd. I don't know necessarily, based on the wording, if this would stack, but that would be even more dangerous if it did. Let's even assume it doesn't. I still think the card is problematic, just as a one-of by itself, because you could just have these turns where you do absurd things, and somebody could find a broken combo, opportunities to make this thing crazy. If it lives for a turn or two, if you get multiple copies of it via cheesing it through your hand, the armor total possibilities are just through the roof. And I honestly, as much as I'd love to do that, that's not the sort of thing I think we need in Hearthstone. If you want to get high health totals like that in Warrior, there should be downsides, there should be limits. It shouldn't happen quite so rapidly as this card would allow it to do. I didn't even account for the Kobold dude. So you could gain 14 armor off of your opponent's minions if they had 7 minions on board. You play your Kobold dude, Blackhand the Destroyer. The sky is the limit, right? The armor totals you could get off this are completely absurd. So I just think that would be dangerous. If you're going to do a card like this, I think it'd have to be more expensive. Make it like 6, 7 mana, so it's harder to combo stuff out in a single turn. Don't give it such reasonable stats for its cost. Like, it needs to have more problems. Because as it stands, this thing is reasonably statted for 4 mana. The upside is ridiculous, and the cost is low enough that you could combo out things in a single turn with it. All of which seem really, really problematic to me. So, I want to play this card, but I know better. I know it wouldn't necessarily be good for the game. And then finally I have one last card here. Speaking of dangerous, I think this one is crazy scary. This is the Grimoire of Anguish, a 1-mana spell for Warlock, and it reads, this turn, damage taken by your hero is dealt to a random enemy instead. And I just know this thing could cause some ridiculous problems or create all kinds of absurd combo opportunities. I mean, even if you don't figure out some way to OTK your opponent with this, which I'm sure people would do, there's got to be some combination out there that allows that. Even if you don't, even if you're just playing Flame Imps and Kobold Librarians and stuff, turning a Flame Imp's deal 3 damage to your hero instead to a deal 3 damage to a random enemy is absurdly good. That's ridiculous. Your Flame Imp suddenly turns into like a, a fire elemental where it's killing stuff on your opponent's side of the board or just killing your opponent outright. So, for instance, like, if you had Echo minions that dealt damage to yourself, boom, your opponent is dead. So Glinda Crowskin plus some Summoning Portal plus Flame Imp times 5 or whatever, your opponent has taken 15 damage and you've built an enormous board with exactly 0 downside. That, again, not going to be the best version of the combo. I'm not trying to solve this, but this is the kind of card that would create absurd opportunities. If this did say damage taken by your hero is also dealt to a random enemy, so you retained the downside, that would be totally fine. That's completely reasonable, because you'd be killing yourself at the same time as killing other things. I think it'd still be powerful, but it would have a check. It would be within reason. But when it says a random enemy instead, that is just absurd. This is too good of a card. It creates killing opportunities. It creates just an enormous board swing opportunities. It removes all downside from really strong cards that are supposed to have downside. I would absolutely hate to ever believe that this card could exist in Hearthstone. If they printed this, it honestly needs to be like 4 or 5 mana or something to create some checks, but I don't think this mechanic should exist at all. I absolutely hate everything that Grimoire of Anguish represents. So there you go, guys. Those are my 5 best and 5 worst Slush cards. Just to reemphasize, I'm not saying these are the best performing or strongest or the weakest. By no means at all. The ones I think are the best designed and the worst designed. Some of the worst ones there would actually be ridiculously powerful, and that's exactly why I think they're some of the worst design cards there. Now, all of that said, keep in mind, Blizzard did not print these cards, at least yet. There is some reason these didn't make the cut. They didn't like them. They thought they were too overpowered. So this is not meant to condemn Blizzard's designs. We don't know if they want to print these. Grimoire of Anguish might have been like, oh no, that is crazy. We have to kill that card. In that case, they made a good decision. That's great. Good for them. I'm not saying Blizzard screwed it up here. I am saying that sometimes they have some opportunities with some of these good cards that I'd like to see. But ultimately, they made decisions for a reason. I'm going to trust those decisions. I just like looking at these options and these alternatives to see what exists, where their mind is at, what could possibly come along down the road. Because it gives us some really cool insights into card design, and it allows us to take a look at some neat cards that we otherwise wouldn't get to see. Now, that said, if you guys have thoughts, comments, questions, crazy reactions to these cards, of course, leave those in the comments below. But until then, thank you so much for watching, and until next time, game on.